funding. And so it's most states that have tackled school finance have gone through that process of actually doing a well-funded and appropriate adequacy study, and it would be nice if the state would undertake that, the legislature direct resources into that to really answer the question of what does it take so that we don't fall into that trap. Kind of the statement also that gets made along with every small tax increase that comes along at the state level, marijuana tax, why do we need more funding? I thought we fixed that with this funding or that funding. So it would really help answer the question going forward.
So Bill, I have a question for you. If we funded the stabilization factor, would we be at 1988 funding levels?
I believe it's 94, but...
No, because Amendment 23 was trying to get to 1988 funding levels.
Oh, was it 1988?
And so the budget stabilization arguably is what we owe to fully comply with Amendment 23. So if we got rid of the budget stabilization factor, would we be at 88 funding levels, or do you know the answer to that?
That's assuming that the inflationary increases that have occurred would be enough to make up for the costs that were identified in 88, which I would suggest probably isn't the case because CPI is not a good, I think that's the policy statement that was made around it, but in reality, funding levels of 1988 would certainly, I don't think inflation adjusted the way we adjust funding for inflation would be equatable to 1988, but I think that's the policy statement that was around that, is getting us back to where we were in 88.
It was the random number that was picked because we had good data around 88. That's my understanding. So I think you're being generous saying it was a policy statement.
Random policy, yes.
I guess they can be synonymous.
Occasionally they are. Moving on, page 7, we have the property tax rates. So these are the components of the mill levy for Boulder Valley. I just want to note that the way this chart is presented, so it says 2022 as the last column. That was what was certified in 21 for collection in 22. So the certification that happened in 22 for collection in 23 in the current year, the general fund component, the largest number on the bottom, is now at 27, and all the numbers have changed slightly. But just to reference that it can be a little confusing because of the way the collection year versus when it's certified doesn't line up.
You can ask a question on this page.
Sure.
This is a draft, right?
Yes.
The second sentence in the second paragraph, general operating fund mills increased. I would love to have that say the state increased it, because I think people need to understand, especially given the rhetoric around the governor and how we're going to lower property taxes. We didn't do this. The state did this. And I think it's really important for people to understand that we had nothing to do with that.
That's a good point. Expand in that section a little bit of the uniform mill and statutory reference to that.
And just so people don't think we're increasing it.
Right, not at the district's discretion.
Thanks.
Totally.
I have a question on this page too. Can you talk about mill levy for abatements, refunds, and omitted property, and what exactly that is?
Yes, so every year taxpayers, whether businesses or individuals, can make a claim as to why taxes should be changed for their property, something removed or that it's of a lower value, and all that goes into that component.
So all of these have to do with property taxes that we have challenged or omit. How does a property get omitted?
changes purpose, something like that.
Thanks.
Yep. And it could be from a historical claim as well. It's not necessarily just in that year. It could be something that has been in the works for multiple years as well. We don't set that number. The counties tell us what that is. And the board certifies that. Next page, we have on page 8 some calculation on assessment rates, assessed value, the difference between business or non-residential assessment rates, just how to calculate that if one was interested. Then we have some inclusion of overlapping property tax rates because it can get a little confusing depending on if you're in a different county, Broomfield County versus Boulder County versus Gilpin County, and the cities and towns and what has been applied in those various areas. So again, just as folks work through their property tax bills that I think are showing up just about now, knowing that the school district is a component of multiple jurisdictions, multiple other jurisdictions, that can be a little confusing. Next, page 9, we have the School Finance Act and the components of it, local funding, property tax being that's the light blue in those two graphs, the dark blue being state funding, and then the specific ownership tax, which is car registrations, which is a component of local property taxes. But as you can see in this top chart, Boulder is approaching being fully funded with local taxes, property tax, and the specific ownership tax. And then as opposed to, say, an Aurora or Adams 12, that is almost opposite of us from a percentage basis as to where they collect their calculated per pupil funding from. The next chart has the local override funding, so the green bars on that chart. So obviously the electorate in Boulder Valley is extremely supportive of the school district, and as evidenced with the recent passage of the bond program, this does not include bond funds. This is just operating dollars. But again, just an example of showing how we compare to our comparative districts.
So is the difference, between what we collect from property taxes and say what Aurora collects, is that strictly property values, or is there anything else in there?
A component of how big the district is, what is made up of it. We have a lot of public lands when you get up into the mountains. We are 500 square miles, but a lot of those square miles are in national forest. The mix of residential versus non-residential, as well as it is a component of growth in a district or lack thereof or decline over time. There's multiple things that kind of go into it, but it's the School Finance Act calculates how much in total the district is to receive for the number of students it has, and then where that funding comes from, whether it's local property tax or state share, changes over time. And so there's a few school districts in the state that are fully funded locally, typically very small districts with oil and gas or resort areas, Aspen. So there's a multiple components, not one answer as to why it looks like that.
Thanks.
Yep. Next, we start getting into a little more detailed level of, on page 10, the school district's general operating fund and the level of control that the district or the school board has over revenues coming in. So starting at the top, more controllable policy decisions around what tuition rates are charged. And this is not tuition to come to Boulder Valley, but tuition for programs and additional services. And then we have our local elections, which are at least controllable by the local electorate being supportive of that. And then the School Finance Act, where we start getting into less controllable, that is driven by how many students we have, as well as the decisions at the legislature. Categorical reimbursements, that's fairly fixed in the School Finance Act. Again, the legislature can control that a little bit. And then specific ownership tax, that's how many cars and what kind of cars are being registered. So really things that are outside of our control in the district. Next, page 11, we have some tidbits of information around our override elections, free and reduced lunch eligible students, School Finance Act, and categorical reimbursements.
Let me ask a question for page 10. Does explain equalized and non-equalized specific ownership taxes?
So equalized specific ownership taxes are a component of the School Finance Act. So going back one page, the little yellow section on those bars, that's equalized specific ownership tax. Non-equalized is a calculation made up of how many mills are in the district and how much is collected in total specific ownership tax, and it's non-equalized is just additional funding to the district. Moving on, we have a couple of charts on page 12 and 13. Yep.
When are we going to not be calling it students eligible for free and reduced lunch? Because I think we're changing that whole thing. Are we still going to call it that even though we're calculating it differently? It won't kick in this year, but this is for next year. So I'm just curious why we're still using that language.
It's the only measure we have at this time. It hasn't been fully defined, and I'm not sure they're going to have that ready for next year. There's been a lot of discussion around it and the interim school finance committee and all that, but whether that truly changed, it's still what the Title I is going to be driven off of. So when we have a new measure that we can use and rely on, we can certainly include that, but this is the only one that we have at this point in time.
I thought they were going to have that new measure kind of figured out by March. I guess what's confusing me, since this is for 23, 24, we probably will have it then, but
They thought they were going to have it. I'm not sure if it's
okay.
if they have all the components that they want to cook into it, maybe.
Yeah, I know they're trying to pull all the data and then figure out what we call it, because we can't call it free or reduced lunch. And it gets even more confusing because now we don't really decide lunch is based on free or reduced lunch because every kid gets lunch. So the whole thing gets really murky for people who are trying to figure it out.
So under Proposition FF, we will still have to comply with the National School Lunch Program and apply for free and reduced lunch status in order to qualify. So it's still something that we will be doing in order to participate in that, because you have to collect as much money from the federal program, and then the state will backfill the rest. Is how it works.
And then how we decide who qualifies will be under this new formula.
It's still it's still the federal calculation of what it is. So if a student qualifies, they move through the system just like they did this year, and then on any other student, the state will make up the difference between the state amount that they have said and what the feds put in.
So we're going to be doing two calculations further going forward, one for free and reduced lunch and one for poverty.
The poverty one, I don't think is something that the district will do. That'll be based on with my understanding, the direct certification and SNAP and all the other programs that exist out there. So not something that the district does.
But still two separate numbers apply to the district, one for free and reduced lunch students and one for poverty, and they probably won't be the same.
I guarantee they won't be the same.
And the impacts on Title I funding,
Right.
right? And so which, Title I is driven by very reduced lunch percentages. And so the challenge will be making sure that our families fill out the forms, so we access all that other funding. But the reality is whether they fill out the forms or not, that they're going to be eligible for free lunches. All students are going to get free lunch. So I think that'll be a Colorado, a statewide challenge. And just hope that there's enough PR campaign, just communications plan around letting parents and families know why it's still important to fill out the paperwork.
But then there'll be a different calculation for the money the state gives us for poverty, just to make things fun.
Yes.
Okay.
But it's not. But that calculation is not yet ready because they're still, as you said, putting it all together.
That's my understanding, yes. Okay, so 12 and 13, the Transportation Fund, Operations and Technology Fund, a couple of the overrides that the district has. Again, just a couple of tidbits of information of places where we get some additional funding into the district and how those resources are used. Page 14, moving into fund balance. So fund balance is always a popular topic to talk about. How much money should be in reserves, how much money is required to be in reserves, what's prudent, what's fiscally responsible, and the policy decisions that go around that. We do have built into board policy, policy DB, that talks about maintaining the Tabor Reserve, which is 3%, and then also a minimum of 3% contingency reserve, and then the board has made decisions in the past to increase that up to 4% currently. While there are options for using buildings for collateral for your Tabor reserves, those things kind of get complicated, and if you don't have cash for your Tabor reserve, you have to you are required to maintain a cash reserve of at least 3%. So for my entire tenure here, we've always calculated using and have cash as the Tabor reserve and then also the contingency reserve. Next page on page 50.
I thought we were going to have a weather reserve too.
Oh, we do have a little one that's in there. I think it's $500,000.
We just don't say that. Or I missed it. It's fine. I
Yes.
just thought we changed our policy to make sure we had that, but it's in there. Okay.
Well, it's not in policy. The weather reserve is not in
We
policy.
made a
It's just
decision as a board to.
correct to add it to the budget. So page 15, we have some nice information and detail around our differentiated funding formula and supports for schools. This current fiscal year is the second year of the program. Really an innovative way that we have used a portion of our ESSER 3 dollars for targeted support at the high support schools. Rob, if you want to comment on any conversations you've had with other districts or other states kind of around the structure that this creates and
And board members, as you know, we've been asked to present this not only at the statewide level, but through national organizations around, how do you leverage your resources, one-time resources over multiple years to recognize the challenges that individual kids face, and then the challenges that schools face when they serve high populations with students with more needs. So we're really, really excited about how we've allocated these resources. I know that the schools are very thankful and that we've seen real positive results, especially in our high support schools. And they attribute this funding as to a big factor in their being able to get what they need in their schools to make the difference for kids. And so it's something to be really proud of as the other governments do.
And I've asked this question before, we are planning some way to continue this funding once the ESSER dollars run out.
Yes, we've included, it was last year's revised budget, we set some additional resources aside to continue it, and the plan is to build the reserve up in that fund enough to continue it for another round. Whether that round looks different formula, that's definitely to be determined.
So this is a question for one of you. Have any schools moved categories?
On the school performance framework, so as you all will recall, Alicia Sanchez went from turnaround to performance, so moved up 2 categories. I believe, and I'm going to look at Robin and Gora, that we have all of our schools in performance except for one. Is that correct? Is Casey, which is now has new leadership and is benefiting from the funding. And so big shifts. Again, if you were to look at the way that, not that I agree with the state accountability system as a preface, I think there's opportunities there to get better. I've shared my thoughts on that with this board. But based on the way the state looks at it, with the highest performing school district in the Denver Metro. So I think that the results based on the test scores and the limited measures of our current accountability system would support yes. Our kids are certainly achieving academically between growth and achievement in much higher rates.
So then as schools, rise up, that will cost less for the targeted supports?
So when this was put into place, it was a 3-year plan, so not changing a school midstream so that they could plan for those full 3 years on those resources based on, and we based it on the specific student count in place in the 1920 school year, so before there was a decline in student counts. So it was sort of the best of all worlds as far as calculating where a school might be.
So Katie, it's based on this type of student, not performance. So it's completely separate from that accountability. So if you see it's how many special ed students, that's how it, so I don't think you're going to see a lot of movement in the flexible support, targeted support would be my guess.
The flexible, targeted, and high is based on the performance. So 10 times that base allocation, that's where the performance piece really kicks in versus the per pupil amount student counts.
As we get closer.
I'm confused.
So what Bill's sharing is there's 2 things that we've weighted. We've weighted students, right? So special education students who qualify for free reduced lunch, and our CLDE students. And each student that each school has gets a certain amount. And then the flexible support, targeted support, and high support, those categories are determined right now through a calculation on school performance framework. So at the end of 3 years, what my commitment is to this board and what we shared at the beginning is we would need to do some academic return on investment. And we also need to see what resources do we have. Right, to Bill's point, we put dollars aside. We'll continue to put dollars aside to create a one-time bucket of dollars that we could then, at the end of 3 years, we'll have a decision point. Do we want to continue the funding as is? How much resource do we have? How long could we do that? Do we want to rethink any of this, which we would have the opportunity to do? But the big idea is that we will continue to weight and differentiate funding in the ways that schools need to support it. We just have to see what resources we have at that point in time, and to what extent has the things that schools have put into place worked, right? So we're seeing high returns and high support, right? I'm interested to see what we see with those dollars of flexible support and targeted support. And I think that time will tell how those investments have been used and what returns we have.
And I'm going to jump in, Rob. It's a perfect segue. I think the public might be wondering, what things has this money been spent on? Can you give some examples, maybe from talking with teachers and teacher roundtables or leadership?
Absolutely. I think that each and every school had the opportunity to come together, involve their school community in deciding what it is that they wanted to invest in. Where we've seen DEI coaches, data-driven instruction coaches, we've seen interventionists, we've seen software programs, we've seen additional tutoring. I think that there's a smattering of investments over the 51 schools that we invested in. I think that as we get closer to where we are at the end of that 3 years, we'll have better data to share on what those things are, what they look like. I know the last time we presented on this to the board, we gave some examples, but we'll have more specifics and more detail as we get closer into this time next year, which would be coming up on the end of that would be the third year, almost to the third year, and we have to be making some decisions.
Moving on to page 16 and 17. So these are spending patterns within the district of the major categories of expenditure. I won't go through all of this, but it just gets to see a pattern both in total dollars as well as a percent of the general fund budget that is spent in particular areas. Moving on to page 18, doing some peer district comparison. So our peer districts that we have been using for quite some time are the top 10 largest districts plus Littleton. Littleton's included because it's a high-performing district. It has great support, financial support from its local community like Boulder has, and so it has always been a compare district for us. The first chart on page 18, so this is data that comes from the state, so this is all the financial information that is submitted. So it just shows Boulder in blue on the left compared to the average of the peer group in green on the right. And it clearly shows that Boulder makes different choices than the peer groups when it comes to allocation of resources. So operational support, slightly less, smaller percentage in the operational support, a little bit more in buildings and facilities. At one point, we were about half on the textbooks and materials, and that's climbed up a little bit. Comparable on administration, and then quite a bit more on a percentage basis on the teachers as what's defined by the state. So again, I think it's just an interesting way to look at those expenditure patterns using some state data.
Can you talk about what would be considered something in operational support since administration's broken out? I think that's not intuitive what would be in there, and it's a large part of the budget.
There is a whole laundry list of account codes that goes into there that I don't know off the top.
Don't need to recount those, just give me one or two examples.
I believe those are things like transportation and probably not the custodial support. That'd be in buildings and facilities. I have to dig into that a little bit more to look at the details of what's in there.
It might be helpful to have an asterisk and a definition.
Little
Examples.
inclusion.
Yeah, so that people know what's
in there. Yep. Next on page 19, at the top, we have a student-teacher ratio. This is not class size. Again, this is also state data. This is inclusive, as the state defines teacher, as regular education teachers, special education teachers, and Title I teachers. But in the past, 5 years ago, we were a little bit higher than our peers, and now we're very comparable to that student-teacher ratio when looking at the peer average. Next chart down, we have student membership. That's certainly been a topic of discussion both in Boulder Valley as well as other Front Range districts. But as you can see, just general declining enrollment over that 10-year time span. Turnover on page 20. This, again, I think is an interesting look at what kind of retention a district has, and also is an indicator of Boulder and some other districts, the high average salaries that the district has. So it's not necessarily that the pay rates are significantly different than other districts, but if you hire folks and they stay with you for a long period of time, for a career even, you wind up with those higher salaries. Districts that have a lot of churn at any kind of position, that's typically going to drive down those average salaries. So again, looking at Boulder in the blue as compared to the peer average in the green. Student populations, so this is just information that's on the website, Boulder website on the enrollment page, are counts and percents of different student characteristics. Next couple of pages, we have information on the student outcomes, graduation rates, dropout rates. And so, again, just to highlight some of that information, this tends to be a little dated, just sometimes because of the timing of this, but we certainly update these as soon as we can with the state information that comes out.
Well, excuse me, I have a question on 21. What students are not funded?
Let's see, what is it? F1 visa students are students that actually pay tuition to go to the district. I think we have 10-ish, 10 to 20 usually in a year. Then a student that might not take enough classes, they're enrolled to be counted. So there's a handful of small number of students. Preschool is going to also be a piece of that, I think. Let's see, page 25, some summary information on our 2014 building program. And then also on page 26, the 2022 program as just recently passed by the voters. So just some high-level information. Certainly as that gets pulled together and more detailed information is available, we'll include that in the final version of this. And certainly the website is going to have the most current and up-to-date information there.
So a question for probably Rob. Do we know why, on page 24, the limited English proficient dropout rate skyrocketed?
I do think we're scheduled to, so graduation and dropout rates came out last week, is that correct? And so we'll be giving the board a more in-depth update on what that looks like. I don't think we could get into the details here, but we want to keep Bill going. But certainly our dropout rate did take up, our graduation rate down slightly. We shared a press release on some of the details of that, shared that with the media last week, shared that with the board in our communication. We'll have more. We can either do that during superintendent's report, or we can have a pull-out session, but we need to share that information with the public.
And I had the same question, Robin, I'd add special ed, because that dropout rate went up. So I think areas that we would be concerned in is where we saw the increase. So-
Yeah, and we'll have to talk through the nuance of dropout rates and what actually causes someone to be considered a dropout by the state's withdrawal codes. And so some of that will be some cleanup to do there, but we can get into details when we present at our next meeting.
Page 27, we have the budget development process and milestones. I went over that in detail at the December board meeting. Next on page 28, we get into the governor's budget, the November 1st budget, statutorily required for the governor to put forth a state budget for the legislature to consider. Also, there was an update to it that came out in January, but it's kind of the initial foray into what it looks like for K-12 funding in the next fiscal year. And so just some highlights there of what was included in the governor's budget. Then I get into several pages of the economic outlook for the state of Colorado and Boulder County. This is information that is directly taken from, as referenced here, from the Business Research Division at the Lead School of Business at the University of Colorado annual. This is the 58th year that they've been doing this forecast for the state of Colorado. I am not an economist and not a economic forecaster, although I do get to write the K-12 portion of this. But just great minds from all over the state putting together a forecast for the state, and it has a high-level look at what the projection is for the state going forward. I think some of the interesting bits that come out of this on page 30, the little table at the bottom there from the State Demography Office on the projection of population change. So the group that is ours, the students in 0 to 17, having the largest decline in the state of those population categories. And so this is something that the state has been looking at and keeping an eye on, and what those impacts are. I think we're starting to see that in other districts, talking about declining enrollment, as well as conversations within Boulder. Education, so again, this is mostly drawn from information out of the governor's budget and what the forecast is looking forward, and some summary information for the national and state economy. Boulder County, in the report, they do all the areas of the state, not all the counties, but sort of big economic drivers within the state. Then the last section we have here, which was one of the requests of why we started this document, both to summarize everything and sort of have a kickoff at the high-level conversation of the economic or the forecast for the district, are these assumptions and estimates. So at this point in time, these are the best bits of information that we have as we go forth developing the budget. So the inflation rate, which is driven by the Denver, Aurora, Lakewood Core Consumer Price Index, it's put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics at the federal level, so this is not something that anybody locally puts together, but the governor's budget included 8.3 projection. The OSPB, Office of State Planning and Budget, and the Legislative Council staff slightly differ in some of their forecasts sometimes. And so the governor had 8.3. That means he's probably a little bit high in that projection. In the December state revenue forecast, the Legislative Council staff had a slightly lower number at 8.1. It'll be somewhere around there, is my hunch. Employee compensation and contract adjustments. So this has been our practice for quite a while, providing those longevity and salary schedule movements, the cost of living at that state CPI number. The health and dental benefits is a 5% rate increase based on the current contract language. And then any market adjustments for salary schedules or staff as appropriate. Little information on the student population, so additional projected decline going into next year with about 3,000, about 10% over 5 years of a decline in student population. Staffing adjustments, so making adjustments for declining enrollment, so resetting those staffing ratios, just to remind the board and the public, as we go into the development of the budget and putting out staffing for schools, we want to not constrain schools so much that they aren't able to hire the folks that they need going into the fall. And then we make some adjustments to staff at schools if the students don't come in exactly as projected. But what that means is we often put out one-time resources into schools to maintain the staff that were placed there either in the spring or early in the fall, and then the following year we make that adjustment. So it's a use of one-time resources, but helps provide some continuity within the school year so that we're not moving teachers and students around in the fall, which can be impactful. So that's the one-time staffing to address the enrollment uncertainty. Budget stabilization factor reduction, so an improvement. So the governor included a little improvement in the budget stabilization factor, so it's less of a cut projected going forward next year. Whether the legislature wrestles with that and makes a decision to change that either permanently or on a one-time basis, we'll see how that plays out. Contractual price escalations and operational expenditures, plural. Certainly we're seeing price escalations, inflationary impacts on a lot of the operational areas in the district. And so we'll have to wrestle with those going forward into next year. Implementation of strategic initiatives in alignment with the strategic plan, and then also maintaining our reserves for that continued fiscal stability. 4 minutes left to ask any other questions.
So Bill, on this last page, I'm wondering if, just thinking out loud here, one of the big pressures on the general fund, our general fund, is the underfunding of categoricals. Transportation, SPED, ELD. I'm wondering if we could put something in to explain that.
Yes. Sort of here's the large dollar amount total expenditures in those areas compared to how much funding we receive to support those areas.
Something like that, yeah. Because I think people need to understand how little we get from the state and how we still have those responsibilities to do those things. And we do it, but it doesn't come without a cost. So I'm just wondering if we could put something like that.
Yep.
I mean, think about it. But
Yeah, there are components of it in different places, right? So we have categoricals in here as a revenue stream. They're not broken out, but that would include those funding streams. We have the expenditure side.
Put them not together so people don't understand.
Exactly. No, that's so pulling it together is relatively easy. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay. It's just a thought.
Yep.
Board members, any other questions?
one, and it was, oh, in the comparison where I can't remember where it is, but the administration was in like 7-something%. And that includes schools-based administration, yeah, because they were separated in another spot. So I assumed that's what that meant.
Yes.
HAT kitty, is that what you're talking about?
Yep.
Page 18. I think it's on page
Yeah.
18.
It is, yeah.
Lou, did you get your question answered? Or?
Yes, but it might be good somewhere to just mention that, because it's the page before where you have general administration and school administration are broken out, and here it's not. And I know that people who don't spend their time trying to understand school finance always think that we spend too much on administration. I mean, that's just pretty much what everybody thinks. So it would just be good to have that a little clearer there.
That in all of the categories, as was mentioned, like what's the big nuggets of things that are in there.
Rob?
Just before we close out, I want to commend Bill and our finance and budget teams for putting together what I think is a real clear document. It gives us a way to really articulate how we use our dollars to make a difference for students. You know, when you take the efforts to connect your finances with your strategy, which Bill has done here and has done for the past 5 years, I just think that it's a really great way for our community to engage with our budget if they don't want to dig into the CAFR, which is, you know, it's not CAFR, it's
Budget. Well, it's ACFR,
ACFR.
but as well as the budget document. Oh,
Yes.
Lots of great
Budget document.
great
So I
information.
think it's a great way for folks to engage. And great feedback tonight, board members. Appreciate your engagement on this.
So Bill, what are next steps? When will this be called the final, or just the strategic financial plan, and then how do we distribute it?
So we updated on the website. That's about the extent of the distribution of it. So certainly the revised budget comes at the next board meeting. There's some state, those comparisons with our peer districts. We have to wait until the state publishes that information, which can take a little while sometimes. I think we usually have it done in a couple of months from now.
So you'll give us a heads up when it's done?
Yep.
Anything else for Dickerson? So we need to take a break because we need to reset the system. So that's fine, we'll take a 5 to 10 minute break and then we'll reconvene. I'd like to call us back into session, the BVSD work session for January 17th. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Anderson to do the introduction for the next part of our meeting.
Thank you, Board President Gephardt, members of the board. Tonight we have with us our officers from our District Accountability Committee. I see Chris Haynes is on, and Jorge, are you with us as well?
Yes, I'm here. I can now hear you, I think. Can you speak again?
Yep, Jorge, are you here with us?
Yes, I'm here.
There he
we
is,
go.
live and in person, okay, or virtually. And so, board members, we have a meeting with District Accountability Committee leadership at the beginning of each semester, where the board can have a conversation with DAC leadership around opportunities for them to work together with us as we're thinking about our priorities for the upcoming semester. We have not gone through our board prioritization yet. So this is an opportunity for us to hear from DAC and some of the things that they would hope to work on, and the board to give DAC any direction that they would like to give them in regards to things they're interested for DAC to investigate. So I'll stop talking and I'll turn it back over to you, Kathy.
Welcome, Jorge. I think we'll just turn it over to the two of you and take it from there.
Hi, thank you, Kathy. Hope you can hear me okay. I appreciate you inviting us to this meeting to kind of check on how things are going. We've had a very busy and productive year, I think, so far. The big part of the first part of the year was focused on reviewing the UIP recommendation and making UIP recommendations. And I want to say that we really appreciate how responsive the district administration and the board were to feedback from DAC and to other constituencies in the community regarding the need to look more explicitly at kind of root causes in the form of institutional racism and bias that's endemic to our system. I think that was a really big step towards addressing kind of longstanding disparities that we're still seeing today. So we appreciate that responsiveness. We're currently reviewing the budget, drafting budget recommendations. It's nice to see that the district has been moving forward with the long-term planning committee and that is starting to take shape. We're focusing a little bit more on kind of what type of steps we take in the short term to think about the post-pandemic landscape in the context of declining enrollments and in addressing these disparities moving forward. So those will be coming to you, I believe, next week. We heard back about the bond, which is a big success, the Grad Plus program, and some changes that are coming in regarding more support for MTSS and differentiated funding for schools. So that's been very positive. Moving towards the second half of the year, we've got a couple of things that are, we've set up as priorities. The first is kind of continuing this work that we began with the UIP in terms of looking at the implementation, in particular looking to things like the disproportionate discipline data that has been drafted. I know that that's supposed to be something that's kind of evolving and should be receptive to change. So we've been kind of reaching out to Jonathan Dings to kind of find ways to do a couple of things. One is make the data more useful so that we can distinguish between behaviors and incidents that are arising from the types of disciplinary responses or measures that are being taken. So we kind of better tease out the two ends of the equation. And the other part is to increase the utility of the data that's being made publicly available or available to principals in schools, as well as the forward-facing dashboard data that in its current form is very much a work in progress. So that's been something that we're thinking about focusing on for the spring. The other part that we're thinking about for the spring is really continuing to work on the policy changes moving forward. I know we're working on policy KB now and thinking about how we will or drafting better language to help guide the partnerships with the families, parents, and community organizations. And I think Christopher can speak to that a little bit. And I think those are the two kind of big things that we have on the agenda moving forward towards the spring. And anything else that you might want to throw our way. But Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Sure, thanks, Jorge. I'll add just a couple of points before we turn it back over for discussion. And just on the policy prioritization front, just as Jorge said, one of the big priorities for us in the second half of this year is continuing to drive forward the work that we've been doing on the recommendation for a possible adoption or revision of policy KB. Some of the folks on the board will know this has been sort of a long process that was actually started in earnest by the DAC policy subcommittee last year, where some drafting was done. And then we initiated a round of stakeholder feedback and review in consultation with District Council Kathleen Sullivan. So across the fall, Kathleen was able to solicit some really great feedback and did some redlining with district staff on the original draft that DAC policy subcommittee had put together the previous spring. So now that we're through that particular round of stakeholder feedback and review, we're proceeding to engage with Jamila and others on DAC and the Family Engagement Subcommittee group, as well as Capitol leadership to get their eyes on the current red line, and hoping through those various rounds of stakeholder review to end up with a proposed policy that meets a lot of needs, is well-rounded, and has benefited from a diversity of viewpoints and pens and pencils, to put it succinctly. So we're excited to drive that forward. We're hoping to bring that before you all to take a look at and consider with a memo of recommendations this spring. So we'll be working with the DAC policy subcommittee chairs, Terry and Sandy, and myself will be working with Kathleen and Laura to try to get that on the calendar. So we're excited about KB. The other two things that I'll bring up on the policy front are our DAC policy subcommittee is currently working on doing some literature review in preparation for a directional memo on a possible revision to policy JECC on open enrollment and assignment of schools, which we know has been on the board's list of priorities, and we've been working closely with Kathleen on that. So we are hoping to get something in front of the board this spring in the form of a memo related to JECC. And we also, I know we talked about this back in our September work session, but we are hoping to pick back up the thread on the revision and memo and presentation that was done to the board on policy AE and AER, which really occurred right in the thick of our the upswing of the pandemic and was never ultimately adopted. So we'd like to re-bring that to your attention and reopen a discussion about AE and AER, which has to do with the constitution of DAC and SAC and the mission and purpose of those groups. So those three policies, KB, JECC, and AE/AER, have been on our docket for a little while now, and we're looking forward to driving those forward this spring and making some progress and engaging with you all on the board. So I'll pause there. That's just what I wanted to add to round out the policy conversation. Thanks, Jorge.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. And I do want to add a couple things that I forgot to mention. As part of that discussion regarding the discipline data, there's a general interest in kind of learning more about the implementation of the school safety counselor program, our move towards restorative justice practices, and the increased investment in mental health.
And Jorge,
yes,
you're cutting in and out, so we're not getting everything you're saying.
that's it. Let me try that one more time and a little more slowly then. So in addition to the work looking at the data, we've also been this interest among the DAC in terms of looking at the implementation of the school safety counselor program, and looking at the ways in which we're moving towards building more restorative justice practices and responses, and our increased investment in mental health resources across the school district as a part of that discussion. And I believe, and then that was all that I wanted to add. Did that come through okay?
So if I can paraphrase, you're looking at bolstering our restorative justice practices in some of the schools and the data for the safety advocates. Rob's going to interpret.
Yeah, I think I was able to capture what Jorge was saying. That there's interest in reviewing the school safety advocate position and how we're utilizing and leveraging those positions to increase restorative practices at scale across the district, right? And so between that and also reviewing our disproportionate discipline data and looking at how we can make the data more actionable for SACs and schools. Do I have that right, Jorge?
Maybe you can elaborate on what Jorge was saying about family partnerships and that work that they wanted to look at as well.
I think that's around policy KB.
But,
and working with their family engagement subcommittee that they have at DAC to begin to look at recommendations around improvements to policy KB.
Thank you, Rob. That's correct. It's around the policy KB work that we would be doing in our family engagement subcommittee.
So should we take questions now? Jorge, I just saw you take your earbuds out, but I'm hoping you can still hear us. Or
I think he's probably trying to hear you better. We'll see if it works.
So we'll wait and see if Jorge comes back, and then we can ask questions. So we have some questions for you, Chris, while we wait for Jorge, if that's all right. Beth has a question or two.
Hey, Chris, having never been on the DAC, I'm curious about how you determine which policies you want to prioritize this year.
That's a great question, Beth. Thank you for that. So essentially, there's a couple different vectors to this. One is we collaborate with district council, periodically through the year, but especially at the start of each DAC year, to understand the current state of the conversations between district leadership, district council, and you all on the board for any policies that have come up as being ready for review or in need of review or in need of revision. And that's one of the inputs. One of the other vectors of how we determine that is kind of ground up feedback that members of the DAC, and specifically often members of the DAC policy subcommittee, have been hearing about or observing on their own or in their parent communities in their schools, things that may need, may be in need of fresh eyes or updates or other kinds of revisions. That's another vector. And one of the others is the ongoing efforts that the district is undertaking to try to make sure that all policies get reviewed or at least re-looked at on a 5-year cycle, so that policies don't become significantly outdated or kind of become vestigial by not having been paid attention to in years, sometimes decades. So there's a few different avenues where policy priority can come up, and then as we take in those inputs and those different vectors, we think about what aligns with the current values and the current thinking and overall priorities that DAC is undertaking at any given time, what aligns with what we think we can give sound and useful and actionable feedback on as a consultative body in DAC, and then that kind of flows into the work that we try to do each year. I hope that helps, Beth.
We have Jorge back.
Yes, I'm back, and I believe I can hear you.
The conversation that we just had with Chris and Beth about how policies are decided to be looked at by DAC. You heard that?
Yes, I did.
Great. Okay. Just wanted to make sure we're all caught up. Okay. Nicole has a question now.
Thanks, Kathy. I have a couple questions, but starting with the policy. So our review practice is study then action, and I'm thinking about the time we have left this semester and how this board will be changing inevitably come next November. And I am curious, thinking about how we work through policies and the timelines we have. Do you feel comfortable that you'll have those review pieces to us in advance of us potentially getting that work done this year? Or what is a firm timeline we can expect from you on those 3 policies you had mentioned?
Because you were looking there, okay.
Kathleen or Chris? I was looking at Kathleen, and because Chris wasn't on the screen, but.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I do feel confident that we are going to be able to move these priorities through the way we've committed to. It always takes longer than we want to, but honestly, I look at these policy accomplishments as being on a 2-year timeline. We're in year 2 right now, and I've committed to DAC that we're going to get those done and in front of the board. And I've also spoken with Dr. Anderson about how we can accelerate the review of some of those others with the really old timelines. So I hope you're ready, board members. There'll be a lot of good reading to do. And I also did just make a note that when we're working on a draft, and DAC already has it, as do some of our other community groups for feedback, that's probably a good time for me to share that red line with the board. So I'll make sure that I do that with the red lines that we're already working on.
That'd be much appreciated. Thank you, Kathleen. And then my other question was, in the very beginning, Jorge, you had mentioned kind of looking at the outward-facing data dashboards and some improvements there. And then later you spoke specifically about some of the behavioral data. So is it just the behavior data and the outward-facing dashboards on those pieces, or is it the other components of the data the district is collecting as far as our metrics that you're considering providing feedback on improvements for?
Thanks, Nicole. That's a great question. Regarding the dashboards, It's providing more general feedback across all the different metrics to make the data more useful. And so it's really a lot of more things like providing definitions, making sure the numbers make sense, thinking about scale, facilitating data dictionaries and tools for the SACs and the DACs, and doing those sorts of things across the board for the different types of data and how it's presented in those sorts of things. In addition to the more explicit work with the discipline data to get more fine-grained distinctions between behaviors and responses at the district, across school districts or across the schools.
Thank you for clarifying that. And I agree. I love the fact that we have these dashboards and are publicly and transparently sharing this data. And there's work to improve on that in the coming years.
So it's a great start, and I think we can, keep making it better.
This will be, I think, valuable conversations for me as we work with our team around, to what level of granularity is necessary, right, for school level, school personnel versus district accountability committee versus SACs versus the general public. Certainly we're always looking to improve. So I look forward to engaging in those conversations. Again, our strategic plan metrics dashboards are for the general public, right? And maybe it's a different cut that SACs are going to need as they work with their principals and work within their school communities to tackle challenging issues.
So I'll just add, it sounds like the DAC has a lot on their plate for the rest of this calendar year, and I cannot imagine putting another piece on your plate. So thank you for all you're doing. And I look forward to hearing what you have to present to us later on this year.
Kitty, questions? Any more, Beth?
I'm good.
Lisa? Richard? All right, well, leave it to you, Rob, to bring it home.
Jorge, Chris, appreciate both of your leadership. Really appreciate this conversation. Speaking for our governance team, we value your input, value your partnership. You all have helped us as we're striving to reach all of our goals, and so appreciate the partnership. And board members, again, as we go throughout the course of this semester, if there are opportunities for things to shift or for us to engage in DAC, as a reminder, Kitty's our board liaison to District Accountability Committee. She can bring those directly on behalf of the board, and I am at every DAC meeting, and I can also share as well.
Hey, and Chris, at the next DAC meeting, and we're putting the dates out now, we're doing the candidate, I don't know what we'd call them, potential candidates to come talk to the board, so we're trying to get those dates out, so if you could help us spread those out to the SAC committee members, that would be great, and I'll send you those dates. We just are settling on them tonight, so, but we want to get the word out. We're doing 3 in February and 2 in March, potentially 2 in March, and trying to spread it out over like midday, weekend, evening times. So we're hoping we can get, we have 4 seats that are up, and so we're hoping we can get some interest in those seats. So anyway, I just wanted to give you guys that heads up so you would know when those emails started coming, what we're doing. So thanks.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Good of the order tonight. So board members, I will see you all on Monday for our prioritization meeting. And then Tuesday we have the tech open house, which is always really fun. And then a board meeting. I think that covers us for the next week, unless Laura or Rob, if I've forgotten anything. And then we have potential dates for the prioritization number 2, which Laura has sent out from Heather's calendar. So we can get back to Laura on that. Laura, is there anything else we're trying to schedule?
Nothing other than lunch with our legislators,
Right.
but we'll address that later.
Okay.
I will be sending out a doodle poll for the 2 dates proposed for the advocacy meeting.
Okay, great. Okay. I think that's everything. Safe travels, everyone. Do we want a snow day or do we not want a snow day? All right, thanks.